Welcome to the first episode of Digital Photography One-on-One. In this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the basics of flash photography. Now, just because the stuff is basic doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, this stuff is so important that it could revolutionize the way you use your flash. This is good stuff. So let's begin by looking at some of the questions that were sent in. To get the best results when using a Canon 580 flash unit on a 20D, should I stick to ISO 100? Would you ever change the ISO for some reason? Can you please explain key shifting to me in regards to outdoor portraiture? Once I establish a meter reading on my subject of, say, f8, what do I have to do to lighten and darken the background? These are great questions. And the first thing we need to understand is how our camera's shutter works. On most cameras, the shutter is what's known as a curtain shutter. And it's made up of two curtains that open and close to obtain a proper exposure. These curtains have names, the first curtain and the second curtain. And they open and close to reveal light to the sensor, much like an actual curtain in a theater works to reveal what's happening on the stage. So let's dive in and take a closer look at how these two curtains work. When you press the shutter release with your finger, it tells the camera to open the shutter. The first curtain opens to reveal the light to the camera sensor. Then the second curtain follows behind to hide the light. Then the curtains reset and wait for you to press the shutter release again. Let's watch that again. Notice in this animation that the first curtain opens completely before the second curtain begins to follow. This only happens at slower shutter speeds, usually speeds under 200th of a second. Now watch what happens when we speed things up. When the shutter speed is faster, the second curtain can't wait for the first curtain to open all the way. If it does, it won't make it across in time. Notice in this animation that the shutter is never fully open. It just reveals a slit of light as it travels across the sensor. As the shutter speed increases, the slit becomes smaller and the curtains move faster. Now that you know how the shutter works, we can begin to talk about a few things. The first, sync speed. Sync speed is the shutter speed on your camera that allows the first curtain to fully open before the second curtain begins to follow. In other words, it's the fastest shutter speed you can use with a flash. Let's take another look at that animation, this time with the flash in the mix. When our camera's shutter speed is set to sync speed or slower, a few things happen. When you push your shutter release button, the first curtain opens. And as soon as the first curtain is fully open, the flash fires. Then the second curtain closes. Now, if we set our shutter speed too high, we'll have problems. Let's take a look. When you press your shutter release, the first curtain will begin to open. But before it's fully open, the second curtain begins to close. When the first curtain is fully open, the flash fires just like it did before. But this time, part of the sensor is covered by the second curtain. This will cause our photo to have a black area. And the faster your shutter speed, the more black you'll have in your photo. To make sure you don't have this problem, always set your shutter speed to your camera's sync speed or slower. Sometimes sync speed is called X-sync. X-sync and sync speed are the same thing. You can find out what your camera's sync speed is by looking in your user manual. For most cameras, it's 1/200th of a second. You may have noticed that I keep saying, if you set your camera's shutter speed to sync speed or slower, that's because if you slow down your shutter speed, you can create magic. That's because you're actually controlling two exposures at the same time. You're controlling the ambient light exposure, that's any light that's not coming from your flash. And you're also controlling the flash exposure, that's the light that is coming from your flash. Now, to help you understand this, we're going to do a little exercise. We're here in the parking lot of our studio, and it's not a very glamorous location, but it's a perfect location for this demonstration. And I'm keeping this simple by using just a single ProPhoto head and a softbox. And this is going to give a nice soft light on our model here. This is Megan. And I've already metered this, so I have my camera set to 1/250th of a second, which is my sync speed, and this is metered at f18. So I'm going to take two pictures, the first without a flash, and the second with a flash. Look right this way, Megan. Look right at me. Gorgeous, just like that. Perfect. Let's take a look at that photo. Now this photo is absolutely black. That means at 250th of a second and f18, there's not enough ambient light to get a decent exposure. So now let's take another shot, this time with the flash on. There we go. Wow, look at that. In this shot, Megan is lit, but the background is still totally black. What that means is that the only light that the camera sees is the light that's coming from the flash. Now, if we want more ambient light, what we'll need to do is slow down the shutter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a series of shots where I progressively slow down the shutter so you can see how dramatic this is. And that's key shifting, simply using your shutter to show more or less ambient light by either slowing down the shutter or speeding it up. Now, if you don't have a fancy light meter and a pro photo setup with a softbox, you can still do this. You can just use an on-camera flash like a Nikon Speedlight or a Canon 550, 580, something like that, and actually the camera will do most of the work for you. Simply put your flash on your camera, set your camera to manual mode, and then set your aperture setting to something about 4.5 and your shutter speed to around 200th of a second. Then take a photo, slow down your shutter speed, take another photo, slow down your shutter speed again, and take another photo, and just keep going to see what happens. It's a lot of fun. In fact, let's try it. That was a lot of fun. Thanks a lot, Megan. So remember, if you're in a low light situation, you can always increase your ISO setting. Doing that makes your sensor more sensitive to light, and so your shutter speeds don't have to be so long to get that ambient light in the picture. It's as simple as that. Now, if you have a question for digital photography one-on-one, just send it in to studiolighting@gmail.com. I'll see you next time. Welcome back to Digital Photography One-on-One. Well, we've been getting a lot of great questions, but we've been seeing two quite a bit. Those questions are, how do I use a light meter, and which light meter should I buy? First, I'm going to show you how to use a light meter. Then I'll give you some guidance as to which light meter you should buy. But before I do any of that, let me first show you how light meters work. There are two basic methods of metering light: incident metering and reflective metering. Your camera's built-in light meter uses reflective metering. Here's how it works. Light travels from its source and reflects off the subject and into your camera's lens. When the light enters your camera, it travels down the lens and then it hits a mirror. The light is then reflected at a 45-degree angle up into the pentaprism and finally out the eyepiece. The mirror and pentaprism allow us to see exactly what's coming through the lens. Some of the light is allowed to travel through the main mirror and hit a secondary mirror. This smaller mirror reflects the light onto a light meter. This built-in light meter is what your camera uses to show you meter readings in the viewfinder. When you press your shutter release button, both of these mirrors move out of the way, the shutter opens, and the exposure is made. When you are using flash heads that are synced to your camera, they don't fire until the shutter is completely open, which means that your built-in light meter has no way of seeing and metering this light. For studio work, you'll need an incident light meter. Instead of metering light that reflects off the subject, incident meters measure the light that is actually falling on the subject itself. You simply place the meter next to your subject and take a reading. In a normal studio setup, you'll set your camera and light meter to the same shutter speed and ISO setting. When you take a meter reading, the light meter will tell you the correct aperture value and you'll set your camera accordingly. Once you're totally set up, you'll only have to worry about the aperture value. Wow, that was pretty cool. For this demo, I'm going to concentrate on using a light meter for studio strobe lighting. Let's dive right in. The first thing you're going to want to do is set your camera to manual mode. If you leave your camera on any of the auto modes, you're going to run into all kinds of problems. Once you have your camera set to manual mode, we need to set our shutter speed to your camera's sync speed. If you don't know much about sync speed, just look at episode 1 of Digital Photography One-on-One. The other thing we want to do is set our ISO to a low ISO setting. That'll make sure our images aren't very noisy. So I've set my camera to ISO 100. Now that we have all that set up, we need to make sure that our meter is set to match our camera settings. Most meters have several metering modes. This is the Seikonic L358, and it's got 4 metering modes. The first mode is for metering ambient light. So if you just want to see what kind of ambient light, direct sunlight, or if you're outside shooting, that's what you'd use that mode for. But for metering flash photography, we have some special modes. The first one allows you to push this button, which is called a trigger, and what it does is it tells the meter to wait for a flash. And once the flash fires, then it gives you a readout. But the last 2 modes are the ones that most photographers use. The first one is the cable sync mode, and that allows you to plug in a cable to your meter, and then when you pull the trigger, it actually signals the flashes to fire, and you get an instant readout. And the last one is for pocket wizard metering, or wireless metering, and that's usually what I use. And what that does is you don't have to have a cable hooked up to your generator or your monolight. A radio will tell your flash to fire, and you can meter that way. So once you have the correct mode chosen, then you need to set your ISO speed to match what your camera was set to. So my camera, remember, was set to ISO 100, so I've set my light meter also to ISO 100. And then finally, you need to set your meter to your camera's sync speed. So my camera's sync speed is 1/250th of a second, so I set my meter also to 250th of a second. And now the camera and the meter are all in sync, and we're ready to get started. So let me show you how to do that. So we have here a basic portrait lighting setup. We've got a key light, a fill light, and right behind us we have a separation light. There's nothing really fancy about it. So I want to show you how to meter this setup. It's pretty simple. All we'll do is we'll take our meter, we'll put it right at our model's face, point this little white thing, it's called the lumisphere. We'll point that right at the camera, pull the trigger, that'll make the flashes fire, and then we can see what our aperture setting is. Since we've already set the shutter speed and the ISO, really the only thing left to set is our aperture setting. So our meter tells us that this is f8. And so we'll set our camera to f8, and we're set and ready to go. Now I know you also want to know how to set different lights so that we have one a little bit brighter, one a little bit softer. So to do that, you'll have to meter each light independently. What we need to do is take the lumisphere and put it down, and then we can point our meter at the light that we want to meter. The reason we have this down is it will keep the light from the other lights from hitting our lumisphere. So if I want to meter the key light here, I'll just instead of pointing it at the camera, I'll point it at the light and see what that meters. And that meters at f10. And so let's see what our fill light meters here. We'll do that. And that meters at f9, so we can see what our ratios are, and we can adjust those accordingly. Now, after you've metered each of your lights and set your light powers accordingly and got the look you want, make sure that you put your lumisphere back up, point that at the camera, and take a meter reading again. And then set your camera accordingly. A lot of people have sent in the same question, and that is, which light meter should I buy? Well, I highly recommend this one. This is the Seikonic L358 light meter. It's the meter I use in my studio. It'll do almost anything you need it to do in a studio situation. But if you need a little bit more power, for instance, you're shooting outside or doing a lot of scenic work, you might need something that does spot meter reading. For that, I recommend the L758DR. It's also a Seikonic light meter, and it'll do almost anything a light meter can do. It's really the cat's meow. Well, that's it for this episode of Digital Photography 101. Thanks again, Megan. That was a lot of fun. Remember, if you have a question that you'd like to send us, send it to studiolighting@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.
This episode